Hey, Jeremy, how you doing?
Good. How about you?
Doing okay?
Welcome back.
Thank you. It was a good week off.
Awesome. Do anything fun?
Lots of stuff that was fun, and I accomplished nothing. It was wonderful.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds, I could go for that.
I guess I shall make sure that the video from last week gets uploaded once I upload the recording for this one.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, we need to do that. And I can help you with that too. We should sync up later.
Hello, Stephen. Hello, Laura.
Hello. Hi.
Good morning, everyone.
I just put a ping to Chojin since he has an item on the agenda for today.
Yeah, looking forward to that update.
All right, maybe we'll just give it a moment, and if we don't have Chojin, we can just move on to the second agenda item and come back to it. Come back to the work API one.
Yeah, that sounds good. And so I guess the second item, we had talked about kind of continuing the conversation from last week on potential cluster registry use cases and what the core characteristics of an API could look like. That seems kind of more open-ended, and also, to be honest, I haven't been able to kind of dig in as much as I wanted over the past week, so I wonder if maybe we can swap with Hector.
Yeah, same for me. I haven't had much time to look into this.
Okay, well, maybe Hector, why don't you start? And Chojin is having problems getting into Zoom, so we can just start with Hector. Go ahead.
Oh, Hector is not here.
We don't have Hector either.
Hector, maybe I saw he just added the agenda item, so I imagine maybe also having trouble getting into Zoom.
Maybe so.
Yeah, Zoom was a little glitchy here coming in.
All right.
Maybe while we wait, since Paul's back, and I see you answered my point on my comment on the doc. Perhaps we can discuss whether we actually want to merge the cluster registration and cluster set docs.
Yeah, that was kind of one of the things that came out of the conversation last week is maybe it actually does make sense to kind of keep them separate.
Yeah, that's my thought as well. Because, like,
Okay.
well, as Tim pointed out when we were discussing the cluster registration doc, we ended up getting into quite a lot of rather implementation-oriented detail there, whereas the cluster set document, which we hadn't gone over at that point, has stayed fairly high level and implementation agnostic. And so perhaps one easy way to, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, we do have Chojin now, so we can finish talking this through, maybe time box it to a couple minutes and move on to work API. I'm happy either way. I'm usually happiest when I have to do the least amount of work, so I'm very happy to leave them separate because that is the least amount of work. That's my vote, I guess.
All right, then maybe we just stick with that.
Yeah, it works for me.
Sold.
Okay.
All right. Chojin, you're up next.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Let me share my screen. Yeah. So from the last time I introduced about the work API that we are working on. For some recap, the work API is to define a list of the manifest on the hub cluster that will be applied on the spoke on the managed cluster. So a simple example here is we define a work that in the manifests in the work API's spec, we can put a list of the manifest or the resources on the manifest, and then the reconcilers of the work will try to apply a list of the manifests onto the managed cluster. And also there will be a set of the conditions for each manifest will be updated on the work's status field to indicate whether each manifest in the manifests of the work API has been applied successfully, and whether the mapping resources has been applied successfully. So there is some discussions last time about how does the namespace implications between the hub and the managed cluster. So I update a diagram here to explain the relationships between the hub clusters and the managed clusters. So this is one possible examples, such as in the hub cluster, we will have a namespace for the cluster G and the namespace for the cluster R, and the work controllers on the different cluster, for example, the cluster G, will try to only watch the work APIs in the namespace of cluster G in the hub cluster. Also, the cluster R's work controller will try to only watch the work APIs on the namespace of cluster R in the hub cluster. But the manifest defined in the work API could be in different namespace than the cluster G. It could be another namespace, such as namespace 4 in the cluster G. So the point here is the namespace on the hub cluster could be unrelated to the things, to the resources that we deployed on the managed cluster's namespace. So this is more like the namespace on the hub cluster will be something like a container that we contain all the work that to be deployed on a certain cluster. But the namespace of the resources that in the manifest is unrelated to the namespace in the hub cluster. So so is that clear, or is there any comments for this diagram?
So I guess on that relationship, the thing that comes to mind is we've kind of been talking a bit about like namespace sameness and kind of maintaining ownership over a namespace, you know, kind of around the cluster set. And if this API works on a cluster set, then you know, it seems like we're kind of diverging from that a bit if we have like this other namespace that maps to a cluster. Because now in the work API, my namespace rights dictate which clusters I can access, whereas normally I just care about which namespaces I can access.
Mm-hmm. So does that mean that for the cluster set so I'm not I haven't involved in the cluster set discussion. So does that mean that cluster set will also follow the namespace sameness? Like we create a cluster set in a certain namespace means that all the cluster that in this cluster set will also have a certain namespace. So
all the namespace sameness really means is that a namespace means the same thing in every, and should have like a common owner or be managed by the same team in every cluster, in a cluster set. I don't think we really dictated that the namespace has to be present in each cluster, just that it shouldn't mean different things or, you know, be owned by a different team. And so with that, like, you know, it would make sense to me if like the same kind of rules extended to the work API. But that, I mean, the complication that comes to mind there is, of course, like if I did have some multi namespace construct that I wanted to deploy via the work API, it's less clear how that would work. But at the same time, I wouldn't have to think about, you know, cluster access, because I think, at least with multi-cluster services, that's been something that we've kind of been trying to steer away from.
So for me, I think it might pay to kind of, well, to point a couple things out to start with, which is, for me, it doesn't seem to break namespace sameness to have the namespace in the hub be a container of things that go to a particular cluster. Like, I do think that we will need to have some cluster level grouping in the hub for things that go to a particular cluster. Namespace seems like a good fit. And I don't think it's incompatible with namespace sameness. And the reason for that is that I think you could implement namespace sameness in the hub if you think of the namespaces for each cluster as an implementation detail, potentially, and think about if I'm scheduling work through some like higher level construct than the work API, that could respect namespace sameness explicitly. And I just don't feel like I get how this could break namespace sameness, but I might be missing something. So Jeremy, do you think you have like a specific example, like a reproducer that breaks namespace sameness?
So I think you're right, it doesn't necessarily break it, but it's kind of this new concept. And, you know, if we think about namespace level access, like we would be, I guess it kind of looks at things in a different dimension. Like, you know, it's a different use of namespace, right? So normally we're like looking at applications at the namespace level, regardless of cluster. And in this mode, we are looking at workloads targeting a cluster regardless of namespace. And those can be compatible. Like, I definitely agree that there's room for something that targets specific clusters. But I just wonder, like, if I'm applying work in cluster G, what's stopping me, owner of namespace foo, from creating work for bar?
Yeah, I guess so. One thing that we could do to implement namespace sameness, like forget about a higher level API and think about making work, like this layer of work respect namespace sameness, is you could have an emission controller that does like a subject access review and make sure that you have cluster set level permission on namespace X before you make a work that puts something into namespace X.
Yeah.
Right?
So
Yeah.
In that way, that mean we still need to have some field on the work API to identify which cluster this work belong.
I don't think so, because the namespace permission should be independent of the cluster, right? Within a cluster set, if you have permission to manage namespace X, you have it on every set, or sorry, every cluster in the set, right?
Okay, yeah, I see. Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. Another part of question is like, if we put a namespace sameness here, so how about the cluster scope resource? For example, would we be able to put CRDs on the manifests?
That's a good question.
That's a very good question.
I think that it's, depending on the layer of resource that you put into work, I could easily imagine people wanting to put storage classes into work, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or PVs. And those are cluster scoped resources.
Yeah, what about cluster roles? Or...
Yep.
Yeah, I think, like, conceptually, there's not much difference. I guess, part of the cluster set, as we've kind of said, the cluster set needs to be controlled by this, by some common authority. And it seems like cluster scoped resources kind of fall on that authority. So just like you might have access to a namespace, you might have access to the clusters.
Tim says that, well, let me just read what he says. He says he missed the intro, but I think this is conflating multiple concepts. Tim, maybe you can say a little bit more in the comments, in the chat. Okay. While Tim puts his thoughts into writing, any other thoughts or impressions from folks around namespace sameness and work? If you are using work, would you imagine that you're using work? Do you think it should support cluster scoped resources? Here's
mean,
Tim's Oh, go ahead, Hector.
Yeah, I would personally consider that. Basically, you let's say you deploy a workload, and this workload has a specific storage class or a specific user-specific kind of backend for storage. So probably is also creating a storage classes. So I guess that's one simple example of a usage. Yeah.
Can anybody hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, how about that? I'm trying something different today with Zoom, and it turns out I have to unmute myself on the computer to use my phone. Who would have guessed?
Nice.
I've been talking to myself. So I will admit I have not read the whole doc. I am confused as to why we're trying to map a whole cluster into a namespace and how you map multiple namespaces into that namespace. Like, I just don't understand the point of it.
Yeah, I think the.
I apologize if that's in the doc. Let me add. I apologize if that's in the doc, and I'll try to catch up and read the doc. And maybe the better point is just to ask questions there. But yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the thing here is like we want to have an agent on the managed cluster that fetch the work APIs from the hub cluster. So one of the possible ways, like we just want what we define work is we define a set of the manifests in the work, and the work is something that will be deployed on a single cluster. So we want that work agent to be only able to access a set of the work that to be deployed on this cluster. So namespace is a way to isolate between different set of the works. So that's the reason why we want to have a namespace to separate the clusters. So a work agent on a managed cluster or a spoke cluster could only watch a certain namespace on the hub and only cares about, yeah.
So I'm confused then, and I apologize again, I have not been following along very closely. I'm confused as to what value a one-to-one mapping here does. Like, why, if I'm a user, why wouldn't I just submit my work to the cluster if I know which cluster I want it to run in?
You mean the works, the work only deployed to a single cluster? I think the reason is that we also want to maintain the status of the applied resources on the work. So on the work conditions, we know how each manifest is applied or available on the certain cluster. So grouping a work, defining a work that can be deployed to multiple clusters might make that status to be too large. Like we need to collect all the conditions for all the clusters that apply this workload.
I'm still confused. Like I don't want to waste the whole time on this, and actually I have to drop off in a few minutes. I'll read the doc. Here's my main question though. If I'm a user who is working within namespace foo, and I want to deploy something to cluster G, and I know I want it on cluster G, why would I go through this API instead of just talking to cluster G?
Kind of elaborating on that, my question is the same. Like the value here seems more like I want something in my namespace in all the clusters, and it seems like being able to deploy to the work API and then select clusters is where I really get a multiplier. But yeah, if I just wanted a namespace foo on cluster G, I could just talk to G.
So I would say that like I would just advise everybody to keep in mind that like we're taking the approach of walking from a leaf in the tree back up. So for me, the value proposition of work is that I can have some higher level primitive that says, schedule this work onto clusters A, B, C, D, E, F, or entire cluster set. And that's probably where the actual value is, where this is an implementation detail of that. And I expect that like, if you just want resources on one cluster, you probably don't want to use work. If you want to, if instead you want to schedule things to like clusters that you don't know in advance that haven't been created yet, like that's where the value proposition, or you want to just assign them or schedule work to a number of different clusters in a set, that's probably where the value proposition is, where it's not directly from work, but it's from a higher level primitive. And in order to make those higher level primitives work correctly, we need to make work correctly.
That makes a lot of sense. But the thing that's confusing to me then is this namespace breakdown, because if we have a namespace for cluster, then it seems like I still need to know the clusters in advance, right? So that I can deploy to those namespaces.
So the namespace alignment with cluster, and I think Chujin may have just said this, but I'm doing this on my phone and I had a phone call interrupt the audio. So forgive me if I'm repeating something Chujin said. Is the idea of constraining the work in a particular cluster to a certain namespace is to limit the degree of permission that an agent applying the work on the spoke needs in the hub.
Okay.
So that is the rationale, to allow that agent to run with a low level of privilege in the hub. Personally, I'm open to like other arrangements, but that was the original motivation. Is that on the money, Chujin?
Yeah.
So that, can I ask one more question? If I have this hub cluster with the namespace for cluster G, where do I specify which namespace within cluster G, or is that hard locked to foo somehow? Does the question make sense?
Would that just be specified in the manifest?
It's in the payload.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
the payload, all right, I'm going to.
Tim, we might have lost your audio again. Sorry,
I feel like I'm asking questions that are probably answered in the doc, and I don't want to waste everybody's time. And unfortunately, I have to drop off. I really wanted to talk about the next topic, but oh well. I'll catch up on the notes. Sorry.
See ya.
See ya. So I guess going back to your question, Paul, I think about the premise, like that makes sense. I think one of the things that we've bought ourselves with the concept of cluster set and this like shared authority and reasonable trust between clusters is that maybe that isolation is maybe not as important. It might not be so bad if the agent that installs things across namespaces by pulling from the work API will be privileged, right? So maybe if we look at a high trust model where it's up to the agent to grab pieces of work that have a selector matching, and I'm starting to assume all kinds of selectors exist here and labels, but let's assume that you've got a selector to find work matching the current cluster, then maybe that's enough. If in a cluster set we're saying that there's a reasonable degree of trust, then these cluster admin level workloads that are responsible for pulling from the work API, maybe we can also trust them to figure out which work they should actually be concerned with.
Yeah, I don't think that we should abandon least privilege as a principle. I hear what you're saying though about maybe the trust model in a cluster set could be different. I still think that it's desirable to have least privilege.
As a rule, I agree with you completely. I'm just trying to think how we reconcile these two, because if I have to target like a piece of work to a specific namespace in the hub cluster, for it to be deployed to a spoke cluster, then it seems like, you know, we now have a common API for targeting the clusters, but you know, there's one endpoint I can target my clusters, but I still need to think about individual clusters. Unless there is just another controller running in the hub that creates work in the namespaces based on some selector as well.
Yeah, I would imagine that. I would imagine potentially many different higher level controllers creating work within the hub. But that's just what I personally imagine.
I can see that working. But maybe the doc could just use a diagram of like a theoretical higher level controller and what that could look like. Because if that was pulling work from various namespaces and applying them to cluster namespaces, then I'm just trying to think about what that actually looks like. If the namespace ever has a traditional namespace meaning in the hub cluster, then we'd have some namespaces that are namespaces and some namespaces that are clusters. And I'm not saying that couldn't work. I just, I'm having trouble visualizing it.
Okay.
I definitely think the point is taken for me personally around like having an example of a higher level controller.
Okay.
How about you, Chojin?
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
I think that would help a lot, because I think everything that you're saying makes sense, but like there are so many different ways this could be used. It might be good to just have an example.
Okay. So just one question. So with a higher level primitive controllers that may relate to something like cluster or cluster set, so just assume that we already have that API for cluster set, for example.
Yeah, like I think like let's assume that all these clusters are in a cluster set, and then I think it just would be good to have a toy example of like how would I deploy a certain workload to, you know, a given namespace across all of my clusters, and what would that look like?
Okay. Yeah. Great.
This is awesome, by the way. This is a very thorough doc, and thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I think that's all for me.
Okay, shall we move on to another topic? We have about 10 minutes left on the calendar entry.
Yeah, Hector, why don't you go next, and then maybe we can talk about the, since neither Stephen nor I was able to look in as much as we'd want, we can talk about the cluster ID registry stuff next week.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to be really brief. Basically, we were proposing to delete or disable some features that has been added in the past to QFed, and personally, I believe they are out of the scope, or in some case, probably experimental as well. and in the future of maintenance and kind of focus on a single role for QFED, which is basically federated resources. Yeah, I propose open two late issues. One to kind of delete the cross-cluster delivery feature, and then other feature, which was the Ingress DNS. Maybe the title was a bit really direct, but the intention was mainly to try to call the attention of any person using the tool. So my question to the meeting, or the question in the meeting, is what do you suggest, how generally we should approach this in terms of, so we basically delete the feature, or maybe disable it and the next release delete it, or some of these features are in alpha state. So yeah, it's a bit complex, to be honest, to keep maintaining it.
I think that you can, since they are alpha, like you should be able to delete basically anything that you want. And I think it makes sense to have KubeFed be focused on doing its core use case correctly. So I'm in favor of deleting features that aren't used. You might want to put, well, I think DNS is already behind a gate as one example. You might want to make sure the gate is off by default if it's not already, and think about adding a warning when you enable the gate that it's a deprecated feature, and message to people it will be deleted on X or Y date.
All right. Okay, yeah, that was mainly to more or less get an idea of the procedure. But yeah, all right, thank you. That's all.
Okay, maybe we can come back to cluster registry use cases next week. It's probably a little late to start a new conversation right now.
Yeah, I just updated the agenda.
Okie doke.
So cool.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Sounds like we're talked through for today.
Yeah, thank you all. Great conversation and great work on the Work API. That's, yeah, good discussion. So thanks.
All right. See you, everybody. Have a good day.
All right.
Bye.